Lisa Baril, who I'm just getting to know, is a science writer who writes about natural resources and science for our national parks. She has a master's degree from Montana State and is a member of the National Association of Science Writers, the Society of Environmental Journalists, and the Outdoor Writers Association of America. As any of us who've been in Montana for more than 15 minutes know, our glaciers are receding. For someone who does ice patch archaeology, this is both a boon and a curse. It also makes Lisa's research more timely than ever. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say. I know you are as well. Without further ado, Lisa Baril.
Can you hear me in the back okay? All right, good, thumbs up. So thank you so much for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see so many faces that I know, and some that I don't. So it's just, yeah, I'm really excited to be here. This is my first book, so this is a new experience for me. And I'm really excited to share with you a bit about my research and what I have learned about ice patch archaeology. So I'll just say a couple things about myself first, is that I started out my career as an ornithologist. So I studied birds all over the country. I landed in Yellowstone Park in around 2005, and like many people, I only meant to stay for a summer. And it's, what year is it? So I've been here a long time now. I never left, except for, getting out during the winter sometimes. But I've been here full time anyway. So I worked for the park for a number of years, 8 years, studying birds. And I loved it. I had such a fantastic experience with that. But I also was very interested in a lot of other things too. And I love writing, and so it drew me to a career in science writing, and so that's what I'm doing now. And so it might seem like a strange turn of events for an ornithologist to write a book about archaeology, but as a biologist and ecologist, we are interested in the natural world and how the environment influences birds, for example, as an ornithologist. And archaeologists do that too. They study our culture, human culture, past cultures, and their relationship to the environment through the objects that they left behind in the past. And most people know archaeology through Indiana Jones, which is to say most people don't really know much about archaeology at all. And that was me before I started researching, doing research for the Age of Melt. And we're, fascinated by lost cities and the possibility of finding ancient artifacts and what that could mean about past cultures and what that could mean about our relationship to the world and the environment. So a lot of what archaeologists do, traditional dig-in-the-dirt archaeology, is rather boring. I don't know if there are any archaeologists in here, I'm sorry. But even as a birder, it sounds, like so glamorous that I spent my 8 years studying birds in the park, right, chasing peregrines and golden eagles, and it was, to some extent, but there were a lot of moments where it was pretty difficult and hard. So very rarely does an archaeologist get to discover something that changes the way we think about the past. There are a couple of those. Can I have the screen, please? So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So while that's happening, I'll move out of the way so I don't hit my head. Archaeologists find typically a lot of stones and bones in the archaeological record, so pottery fragments, bone tools, stone tools, things that really hold up over time and that don't disintegrate over time. And there's a limited amount of information that you can tell about a culture and a society and their relationship to the world around them by those few things. Most of the things that we used in the past were made out of organic things that were once living, like tree branches, to make arrows, for instance, or sinew, which is like the tendons and ligaments from animals that was used to sew fabrics together and make clothing. Those kinds of things don't normally stand up to the test of time, right? So those things kind of disintegrate. Well, enter ice patch archaeology and the whole thing changes. So this is a photo of Altamira Cave in northern Spain. This is an example of Paleolithic art that was discovered in the late 1800s, I think by a child who found it. And Paleolithic cave art wasn't known before the late 1800s, but it occurs all across Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ural Mountains. And it's anywhere from 37,000 to about 13,000 years ago. And prior to this discovery, a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists had just assumed that Paleolithic people were cavemen, I guess, like they just weren't that well developed culturally. But we can see from this beautiful bison here that they actually did quite a lot of artwork. And this really changed the way we think about people in the past, and that they were able to create such beautiful pieces of art. And not only is it, I think, important in terms of art, but also I think these images tell a lot about the life cycles of animals in the past, because if you are dependent upon animals and knowing what they're up to and their life cycles, when they're breeding, where they are migrating, when they are migrating, your survival depends on that. So there was a recent paper I came across a couple of years ago about this is an amateur archaeologist who had pored over a lot of this artwork and came to realize that a lot of the symbols weren't like shamanistic or ritualistic symbols, but they were essentially telling people that would go to these caves the life cycle of these animals. So they were conveying information about the world around them. And so that's one example of how archaeology has changed the way we think about us in the past. Another example comes from Machu Picchu. This is a place that I would love to go here. I've been to Peru, but I didn't get to go to this particular place. It's just another excuse to go back. This is the lost city of the Incas, and it was only discovered in 1911, and it's really a testament to the ingenuity of people to create such amazing architectural art. I mean, I feel like it's artwork of these stone structures and these buildings. And then another example comes to us from White Sands National Park, and this is a little bit closer. So you may remember reading about the footprints that were discovered in 2021. There had been a number of footprints discovered in the park, but I don't believe that any of them were They couldn't age them until fairly recently, and this is because there just weren't any organic remains with the artifacts. But they found these footprints in layers, and between these layers they found some seeds of a particular plant, and they were able to radiocarbon date that plant. So before they did this, a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists had the idea that people didn't arrive in North America before about 16,000 years ago. And indigenous peoples of this nation will tell you that we've been here since time immemorial. And every single time, this is, as I researched this, every single time something was discovered by a white person, an archaeologist, they would push back that date when the first peoples came to this area. And so these footprints are remarkably old, and they are 20 to 23,000 years old. And what's interesting, I think, about this, aside from its age, is that the footprints tell a really cool story of a teenager walking with a child. And every once in a while, she would put the child down, and the child would walk alongside her or him. And then sometimes she would pick up the child and shift the weight from one hip to the other, as you do when you're carrying children. And you could see that play out in the footprints, which would get kind of mushed and a little bit wider when she was carrying the child. And then when she would carry it on the other side of her, that footprint would get a little bit bigger. So it's just the whole story of this family group was told through these footprints, which I think is super amazing. And then there's Ötzi. So Ötzi is a 5,300-year-old mummy who melted out of the Italian Alps in 1991. This one mummy changed the way archaeologists really think about the relationship between people, mountains, and ice. He launched an entirely new subdiscipline of archaeology called ice patch archaeology. In 1991, I'll tell you the story of how this was discovered. It's a picture of Erica and Helmut Simon, and these were a couple of hikers from Germany. And they had visited the Austrian-Italian Alps. The Ötztal Alps form the border between Austria and Italy. They had visited 10 years earlier and had loved their trip so much that they decided to come back. And they noticed how much the ice had been melting in these mountains. I think they crossed one glacier that had lost 10 feet from its front edge in just the 10 years that they had been there. They were hiking down from an 11,500-foot peak and were off trail. So they were trying to get back to the trail. And as you can see, a lot of this is above tree line. So their markers are just not really that prevalent. You can't really tell where the trail is necessarily. So they were looking for cairns or something that would show them where the trail was so they could pick it back up, get that back down the mountain. And they were hiking around this pool of water and they saw something emerging from a snowfield and they thought, that's it, let's go there. And what they found was not a marker. In fact, it was a person. And so this is the first picture that they ever took, or the first picture ever took of Ötzi, the 5,300-year-old mummy. And they were rattled, as you would be if you find a deceased person in the mountains. So immediately they told the authorities, and a rescue effort, or not a rescue effort at this point, obviously, but a recovery effort was launched to get this man off the mountain and figure out who he was so they could tell his family, hey, this person had died and we want to let you know. So he was brought down the mountain and with a whole bunch of his belongings in black trash bags. And the undertaker at a local university was looking at this man, trying to figure out how he died. But he couldn't help but notice that he was wearing a leather shoe. And we wear leather shoes all the time, but this did not look like anything he had ever seen before. The leather shoe was stuffed with grass. That's not something we do. He had been wearing some trousers made out of fur, but those were in tatters. He had a copper axe with him. He had some other stone tools and wooden tools and backpack and just things that really didn't look like they belonged to a modern day hiker. So he stopped what he was doing and he said, let me call the local archaeologist. And so he was on a university campus and he was able to get the local archaeologist to come right over and take a look. So that archaeologist's name is Konrad Spindler. And immediately, without even looking at the body, he was looking at the artifacts because he's an archaeologist, right? So he's looking at the material objects that people have left behind to tell stories. And he knew right away that this was an unusual find, that this was not someone who had gone missing a couple of years ago, or even, 500 years ago. At first he thought maybe 4,500 years old, but when they got the radiocarbon dating back a few weeks later, that information was incidentally leaked to the press, and so he found out about it by someone calling him in the middle of the night asking for a comment. But it blew everybody's mind that there was this 5,300-year-old mummy in the Alps that had melted out of the ice, that he was completely intact with all his ears, fingers, toes, organs, brain tissue, and all of his belongings lying right there in almost perfect condition. Some of them were tattered, but a lot of that happened because of the recovery effort and them just trying to get this person off the mountain. And so the first question they asked is, what was he doing up there, and why and how could he have been preserved for so long? It was more than 10,000 feet in elevation, and he had been encased in ice. And so the answer is, well, ice is an excellent preservative. So I don't know about you guys, but I have a lot of things in my freezer that I just don't pay attention to anymore. They've been there for years. Some of them are labeled, some things are not, and I just leave them there. And as long as your freezer is in working order, you really don't need to pay attention to it. But if your freezer breaks down, then all those microorganisms come to life and they get animated and things start to get funky and you need to take care of it. So as long as he was preserved in the ice, and all indications say that he was for the last more than 5,000 years, he would be invisible to anybody, right? And so it's when he started melting out of the ice that that someone had noticed him. Well, something similar is happening to the ice out in the wild, not just, in our freezers when they break down. So as the climate warms, these ice patches high in the alpine zone are beginning to melt. And rather than the stones and bones of traditional archaeology, the ice has really preserved a piece of human history that typically doesn't last. And so these organic artifacts like branches and plant fibers and animal sinew and bird feathers, like I've already mentioned, and archaeologists rarely get to study them because they decay so quickly once they're exposed to sunlight and wind. And it's only a matter of time. But that was before the ice began to melt. So, I forgot to show you all of the things that he came down with off the mountain. So some of these things are his backpack over on the left-hand side, backpack frame. He had a bearskin cap. He had some medicine bundles, they think, his shoes, and just a bunch of arrows that were unfinished, and a bow case, and a case to carry his arrows in. And this is a photograph of the find site where he was discovered. And you can see now, no ice at all. So, but not all ice is equally good at preserving artifacts. When you think of ice in the mountains, most of us will think of glaciers. Ice patches aren't quite as sexy as glaciers. They're usually smaller, but they can be as large as several football fields. And the thing about glaciers and why they're not very good at preserving artifacts is because they move. And so they move from these high elevation areas where they accumulate snow high up the mountain, and weight and pressure and gravity forces them down the mountain, where some of that ice melts as it gets lower down the mountain during the summertime. And so all of this movement of ice, really anything that would fall on top of an ice patch or on a glacier is going to get incorporated into that glacier and become crushed as this glacier moves down the mountain. So it's not that people may not have visited glaciers, they certainly did in the past, but that anything that was in them is not going to come out the same way it went in the first place. The other thing about glaciers in the mountains is that the ice within them isn't very old. It's only about 500 years old. Even though a glacier may have been there in that particular area for thousands of years, the actual ice within it is relatively young. And this is because of that flow. So the ice is accumulating high up the mountain, it's moving down the mountain, and then some of that ice melts. And then that cycle is renewed. And so that means that the ice is only going to contain artifacts or objects that are about 500 years old. Ice patches, on the other hand, are much more stable because they don't grow as large as glaciers, they don't move. And it's their stability that makes them excellent at preserving artifacts and anything, actually, that falls on top of them. Ice patches tend to accumulate snow through wind drifts. They occur on usually the lee side of slopes. And so it's a lot of wind-driven accumulation of snow. And because they don't move, they are super stable and just accumulate ice, layers and layers of ice over time. They are also often underlain by permafrost, which means that they're frozen from below. Permafrost is frozen soil. And because of that frozen permafrost from below and also the snow accumulating on top, the ice inside ice patches can be many thousands of years old. Like it contained Otzi, for instance, 5,300 years old, but they can get much older than that. So it's these very attributes that make ice patches so good at preserving artifacts, not only for thousands of years, but also in their original state. And so some of the things, I talked to a couple of archaeologists who would find arrows that melted out of ice patches and would say things like, this looks like it was recently made. This could have been, 100 years old or 50 years old, not, 9,000 years old. So it's pretty remarkable. Some of these tools even have bird feathers still attached to them that can be identified by scientists, which is, I think, amazing as an ornithologist. But, ice patch has really been overlooked as places with archaeological potential because no one, thought that the ice was all that old. But also because a lot of archaeologists at the time really weren't concerned with mountain landscapes. They really didn't feel like a lot of people were moving into these mountainous areas. They knew that people were hunting there. They would find bits of charcoal and fireplaces and some stone tools, but nothing really of significance. And part of that is because mountain landscapes are really tough on things, right? We know this from living here, and anytime you spend in the mountains, these are harsh environments. There's a lot of sunlight, which tends to degrade artifacts, and also the soils are super thin and they're highly erodible, so things are just getting flushed down the mountain into the valleys, and then they turn to dust. So all of this meant that not a lot of archaeology came from mountains because there wasn't really that good of a preservation material. And that all changed when they discovered Otzi in 1991. So ice and glaciers has long been in the realm of glaciologists, and this is for good reason. Scientists can learn just a ton about Earth's history from the ice, from digging ice cores and pulling that material out and studying it. So as the ice gets laid down year after year, tiny bubbles of air are trapped within the ice at the time that the ice was laid down. And so they have figured out how to get those air bubbles out and to figure out what the atmosphere was like at the time the ice was deposited. So polar ice sheets are much, much older than mountain glaciers, and this is because, well, it's cold all the time in the poles, right? So there's not a lot of melting going on, at least there wasn't. It's changed a bit, obviously, but over, the last 800,000 years or so, there's been accumulation upon accumulation of ice at the poles. And because it's flat, these ice sheets are flat, they're not moving all that much, and so the ice can be super old inside of them. And so this shows the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels over the last 800,000 years. And this was taken from an ice core in Antarctica. And I'll just say incidentally that there was a project that just finished up in Antarctica that extracted the oldest ice in the world. It's 1.2 million years old, and it's the oldest ice in the world. It's now going to Europe for scientists to study for decades to come. It came apart in cores. Of course, they're not drilling all the way to the bottom in one fell swoop. It took them 4 to 5 years to collect this ice. And if you were to glue all those ice cores back together, they would be almost 2 miles long of ice. Yeah, it's really cool. So it's going to be amazing to see what they can figure out from all of this ice. But this figure comes from 800,000 year old ice, which is still pretty good. So for the last 800,000 years, carbon dioxide really fluctuated between about 170 parts per million and about 330 parts per million. So we know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's a warming gas. When carbon dioxide is low, the atmosphere is really cold and we are in an ice age. when carbon dioxide is high, temperatures are also high, and we're in a warm period. But humans, as we know ourselves today, this anatomically modern human, someone that you would recognize as kid walking down the streets of Livingston, appeared about 315,000 years ago. This is from a fossil that was discovered in Tanzania in 2018. It's the oldest anatomically modern human in existence. Scientists think that we could possibly go back to about 500,000 years old, but that remains to be seen. You never know if you've found the oldest of something, right? So it stands to reason that there's a fossil out there somewhere that's even older, perhaps as old as 500,000 years. But our genus, Homo, emerged sometime around 2 million years ago. So throughout our history, human history, over the last 2 million years, we have lived and thrived in ice ages. We are still living in an ice age today, which doesn't seem real. That doesn't seem true, right? Yeah, we are, and it ended, the last cold. So an ice age is made up of a lot of peaks and valleys. Sometimes it gets warm, sometimes it gets cold again, even though you're still in an ice age. It goes through these cycles. And the last cycle of this cold period, ended around 11,000 years ago. And so we've been living in this kind of just sweet spot of a little bit warmer period, but we are still living in an ice age. And so humans are uniquely adapted to thrive in cold environments. We are not adapted to thrive in hot environments. So we are now in an unprecedented time. By 1950, carbon dioxide levels had surpassed that 330 parts per million mark. Last year, atmospheric carbon dioxide was something like 423 parts per million, which is 52% above the industrial era of 280 parts per million. For context, the last time carbon dioxide was this high was about 3 million years ago, before humans existed, before our species emerged, before our genus emerged. This was called the mid-Pliocene warm period. And temperatures were almost 6 degrees higher than they are today. Can't even imagine 6 degrees higher than the pre-industrial era, actually. So even more so. Sea levels were 50 to 80 feet higher, and humans didn't even exist. So glaciers have really been losing at an accelerating rate since around 1970. That's when the carbon dioxide that we have put into the atmosphere has kind of caught up with glaciers, and we are starting to see that melt happen visually from year to year. So given the current levels of carbon dioxide, half of all mountain glaciers are expected to disappear by 2100, which is only like 85 years from now. It's really not that far away, right? There are people alive now who may not see glaciers in these areas. That's already baked in. There's nothing we can do about that at this point. If we continue down our current path, we're headed for about a 5-degree increase in temperatures by 2100. And we can see this with our own eyes. And I think that's what's so great about ice patch archaeology and studying glaciers in general, is that you can really see from one year to the next, in your own lifetime, in your own experience, these glaciers and how much they are melting. So at this level of warming, all of the glaciers in the Alps are going to be gone. This is the Mer de Glace in Chamonix Valley in France. And while the glacier still has quite a bit of length, you can see how much it's narrowed. This all used to be ice in here. So it's not only narrowed, it's not taking up as much of the valley, but it's also thinned too, which is harder to see. We can think about glaciers as retreating up the mountains, which is also happening, but more insidious even is the glaciers that are melting from top down. So they're just getting thinner, even though it's harder to kind of see that and measure it. Here's an example from New Zealand, Franz Josef
Glacier, and there are a couple of people there for reference. So that whole area that they're standing in used to be ice. There's still quite a bit of ice left there, but not quite as much as there should be. And then this one might be familiar to a lot of people. And this whole area here used to be ice, a glacier, not a lake. And now it is a lake, and this is in Glacier National Park. So I say all this because you can't talk about ice patch archaeology without talking about climate change. I mentioned earlier that ice patch archaeology arose out of our climate crisis. And if glaciers are melting, so are ice patches. So not long after Ötzi was discovered in 1991, other artifacts began to come to light. And where in the world? Well, where in the world is wherever there is ice. And so a lot of the ice, because a lot of the land masses are in the northern hemisphere, that's where a lot of the ice patch archaeologists are focusing their attention. But wherever archaeologists seem to be looking, they are finding artifacts that are melting out of the ice. I wrote about an archaeologist who's actually from, I think he's from Missoula. He lives in Colorado now, but he goes to Mongolia every year, and he's studying the ice patches there. And they are yielding ice patch artifacts, but I think he visited something like 9 ice patches one year, and the following year they had all already melted in 1 year. And yeah, so it begs the question, though, what were all these people doing in the mountains? Were they seeking out ice intentionally, or were they just happened to be encountering ice and losing things, as we do when we travel? In other words, how did their belongings become entombed in the ice in the first place? So to answer part of that question, let's go to Norway. It's the early 2000s, and an amateur archaeologist, they have just this whole cadre of amateur archaeologists in Norway. There's a long history there of people, reindeer herders in the mountains who are, at these high elevation areas, and there's a lot. I'm skipping a little bit of history here that I wrote about, but there's these were the original ice patch archaeologists in Norway. So they had been finding ice patch archaeologists for decades, but nobody really knew about it outside of Norway. It just wasn't something that international media picked up on, or that I think they even realized the significance of at the time. So this reindeer herder was surveying an edge of an ice patch in Jotunheimen National Park, and he found some interesting objects at the edge of it. He found these bundles of sticks, and these sticks appear to be placed intentionally in the ice and kind of like they were stashed there for later use. Some of these sticks had flags or pieces of material attached to one end, and wasn't sure kind of what they were initially. He also found a few collapsed stone blinds. It's a little bit hard to see here, but you can see that there's kind of a structure in the middle. It's rounded, it's raised up. It had obviously been made by people. It wasn't just ice moving around rocks and kind of positioning them. No, this was obviously made by people. And he also found arrows like this. So he told an archaeologist, and that archaeologist actually ended up switching his career. He had worked in the lowlands on these Viking settlements, and he's like, I'm an ice patch archaeologist now. This is way too cool for me to be bothered with the Vikings. I mean, and Vikings sound cool to me, so just testament to how awesome ice patch archaeology is. And so when they returned, they did a thorough survey of this ice patch and found hundreds and hundreds of those strange sticks with the flags on the one end, more arrows, and more hunting blinds. And so they wondered, well, how did it all fit together? And one of the things that they realized is that reindeer, they're known as caribou in North America, spend a lot of time on ice patches. And this is because if you've ever been to the far north in the summer, the bugs are brutal, and caribou are just inundated by mosquitoes and botflies. These botflies will lay eggs in their noses and their ears and their fur, and they're just more than a nuisance. It must just be just awful. And so they go to these ice patches to, number one, escape these insects, because insects don't really like the cold, right? So they're not as active there. Also, there's a lot of breeze that kind of pushes the insects away. And during the hot summer months, this is a circumpolar species, reindeer, and they just get hot. And so they loaf on these ice patches, and they're really reluctant to leave them. Ancient hunters knew this, and they used that to their advantage. And so they would go to these ice patches as a group, as a community, and they would set up these sticks, which they call scaring sticks, as drive lines to help push the reindeer towards hunters waiting behind these stone blinds with arrows and bows and arrows to hunt them. It must have been a huge community-wide event. And I imagine the entire village would come up afterwards to process all of these animals that they harvested. So the scaring sticks work because this is above tree line, and so the reindeer really are not used to seeing these things. That is something that's fluttering above tree line. It kind of freaks them out. And so every year, it's amazing how many objects they've collected, not just from this one ice patch, but they've expanded it all across southern Norway. They have found hundreds of ice patch artifacts from even just one ice patch, thousands altogether, and they go back to about 6,000 years. And as the ice continues to melt higher up the mountains, if people were traveling up to those places, they might find objects that are even older. So just as people were doing this in Norway, they were also doing it in the Yukon. So this is actually a figure that a person, a biologist from the Yukon, had drawn up to show how hunters in that area have used ice patches to hunt caribou. And so as the wind, so the caribou approach from below, and all of these ice patches have visible layers of caribou dung that they can actually extract and test for disease. They're getting all kinds of information about past caribou populations, which is really important because that species is in trouble as the climate continues to warm. So getting a lot of this natural history information from the past is really important. But the winds would blow up the mountain in the afternoons, and hunters would approach from above so that the caribou wouldn't smell them, wouldn't notice they're coming, and then they could harvest them. So archaeologists are seeing the same sort of phenomenon here in the Beartooth and Absaroka Mountains, except that aren't caribou here. So what are they hunting? They're hunting bison, they're hunting deer, elk, bighorn sheep, which all do spend time on ice patches. So I spoke to a scientist who used to be at Montana State University, he's now in Laramie, and he thinks that rather than escaping biting insects, what they're doing is foraging for the halo of green grass that is occurring below these ice patches. So if you think about, the green wave that goes up the mountains during the summer through the fall, and as the grasses begin to senesce and die, they're less nutritious, but these ice patches are little oases, and it's a constant supply of water. So the grass below that always stays green, and if you're an animal, of course you're going to go there, and that's where you're going to spend time and forage. And so they're finding a lot of animal bones that are coming out of these glaciers, including bison at these very high elevation sites, which for a lot of, I don't know why, but for a long time, many people didn't believe that bison occurred that high, and of course they do. I visited one possible bison gifting site or bison jump that was more than 10,000 feet in elevation. So it can be quite high. So I remember reading an issue of Yellowstone Science. This is many, many years ago. And it was an article by Craig Lee, who is an archaeologist in Bozeman. He's one of those rare people who's actually from Bozeman. And he found an extremely rare and unusual object. It was late summer 2007, and he is on the border between Montana and Wyoming, and he's scouting an ice patch and walking along the edge of it looking for potential artifacts. He brought his wife with him, his kids were there, and he walked along the edge of this perennial ice patch, and he saw something odd breaking the surface of the snow. And he told me that his whole body just began to quiver. It's probably something you or I wouldn't look at or think twice about, right? This kind of broken stick here. But it turned out to be part of an ancient hunting weapon called an atlatl. So an atlatl is a really cool hunting tool that came after the spear, which you just throw with your arm, and before the bow and arrow. And it consists of a throwing board. The throwing board has a divot in one end, which you put the dart into. It's the business end of the atlatl, the hunting weapon. And it increases the leverage of your arm. So you take that, and you throw it back, and this is an illustration that a friend of mine did, and it increases the leverage of your arm so that you can throw the dart much farther and faster than using your arm alone, which is important if you're relying on, accuracy and quickness to be able to hunt animals for your survival and for your family's survival. It had been made from a birch sapling, and when he sent off a sample to radiocarbon date it, he discovered that it was more than 10,000 years old, or sometime around 10,300 years old. It is the oldest ice patch artifact found in the world to date, and it's just right here, which is awesome. It's just right here. So that is kind of what got me started on this ice patch archaeology kick to begin with, because I read that and I thought, well, I have to know more. And so I did a Google alert because I'm a nerd, and articles kept coming like every day, and they still are. I still have an alert for this, and it's like every day I hear something new about something that melted out of the ice somewhere in the world. It's really remarkable. A lot in Norway. Those guys are after it. I don't know how they have the time or the energy, but they do quite a lot of work. So, based on Utzi's tools, we know that he was a hunter. And scientists had asked, what was he doing in the mountains at more than 10,000 feet all those years ago? And Spindler's answer at the time in 1991, because he didn't know, was, well, maybe he wanted to visit his girlfriend in the next valley. And it turns out that wasn't the reason why. The real story is much more interesting, but I won't spoil it for you here. Spindler was getting at, though, was perhaps mountains were also used for travel routes for people going from one valley to the next. If you think of the Alpine chain, it's not one continuous chain, but it's many mountain chains that kind of bisect Europe. And you're not going to go around them, right? You're going to go up and over and find those narrow passages that maybe allow for travel from one valley to another. It's not that, it's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging, but it's doable. So a great example of this type of use of travel comes to us from Switzerland. These are a couple of photos of important passes used for travel in the past. This is, okay, here we go. And so the reason archaeologists attribute these passes to use in travel rather than for hunting is the types of artifacts that were found there. They find things like this pin from the Bronze Age that was used to fasten a cloak together. That's not organic, but that's okay. There are shoes, leather shoes. This middle picture here is from a mercenary, I think in the 15th century, who had been found with all of his tools and part of his body. Lots of Roman coins. People were losing their pocket change all over the place. And then hobnails. In the upper left-hand corner, there are lots of hobnails, and those were used to fix the soles of shoes to the uppers. And it's just testament to, I think this is one of the most numerous objects that they found. And they also found, which I found amusing, is a shoe repair kit. So shoes fell apart a lot, and they needed to repair them. And so the sheer diversity of objects that were found in the Alps and that are still being found in the Alps kind of speaks to them being used more as a travel corridor. Of course, people were hunting there too, but that it was really a way for people to get from one side to the other. So if we look at this map again of where perennial ice is, there's a lot of potential elsewhere in the world, like the Andes, Asia, New Zealand, and possibly even small areas in Africa. It's kind of, we've been like talking about Norway, we've been talking about here in the Beartooth, we've been talking about the Yukon. Those are just a fraction of the places where there's potential for ice patch artifacts. And another reason why people travel to the mountains is for spirituality, right? But you're not going to leave necessarily the same types of things, or maybe even anything at all, if you're going to the mountains for spiritual purposes. So while ice patches really aren't that prevalent in the Andes, it's really a landscape of glaciers, but they're starting to melt, and there's still a lot of ice there. But because they're so high, it's 16 to 20,000 feet, they're not as affected as the Rockies or the Alps or other mountain ranges that are at lower elevations, even though they're farther south. So fewer artifacts have been found with this type of journey, but we would still expect people to lose things. And so I want to share with you an annual festival that I had the opportunity to witness. It's called God of the Snow Star, and it celebrates the return of the Pleiades constellation after a long hiatus. When the Pleiades constellation is invisible, it's a time of maybe where bad spirits can come and harm you, and so the return of the star constellation is a really important event. It's a festival where many Quechua-speaking tribes gather, and the purpose is really to pay homage to the glaciers. The Andes are very, very dry. There's not a lot of rainfall there. There's snow in the mountains, way high up in the mountains, but they're getting most of their water from glacial meltwater. For agriculture, for daily living. And so they're really celebrating these glaciers that are the life force that allows them to live there. So just a couple of pictures to share. The Quechua people are, very, very diverse. There's many, many tribes. And they each nation dresses according to their tribal story, and so they're intricate beaded fabrics and patterns that we were witnessing, lots of dancing. It was really amazing. And of course, you might notice this cross in the middle, and a lot of colonized nations, they have just been hijacked a little bit by Christianity. But the Quechua people have really worked towards taking this festival back from Catholicism and doing away with what they don't care about, and then getting back to more of the indigenous and traditional perspectives of their ancestors. So what are people doing in the mountains to kind of help preserve the ice? As people that are living in these mountain communities are especially attuned to what's happening there, and they've come up with many really cool ways and adaptations to kind of help slow down the ice melt and to take advantage of these glaciers and the glacial meltwater. I came across this super interesting story of in Pakistan, where people there actually grow glaciers. And they've done this for many centuries. Nobody really knows how far back it grows. But it's this cool ritual where 12 men will go in search of a male glacier. Male glaciers are those that are super dirty and covered in debris, and that's their interpretation. And female glaciers, and 12 other men will go in search of female glaciers and extract some of that ice. And female glaciers are those white, classic, beautiful glaciers that we all think of. And so they take this glacial ice and they will place it above their village in a chosen spot and bury it in sawdust and other rocks to kind of protect it. And they're marrying these two ice bodies. And what they hope will happen, and what does happen, is that sometimes these form into glaciers, small glaciers, right? They're not natural, but they're bodies of ice that are now embedded in the rocks, and that rock layer kind of helps insulate them. And what it does is provides them with meltwater for their crops during the growing season, because not all valleys have their own glaciers. And if you live in one of these valleys without a glacier, you need some way to get water. And so this was their solution. Well, Chewang Norfolk, on the Indian side of the Himalayas, decided to modify this ancient technique by creating his own type of artificial glacier. And so what he would do is find the meltwater channel of a glacier that was already in existence, a wild glacier high up in the mountains. And as the meltwater came down, he would build these terraces to divert some of that meltwater. And those terraces were built to be a little bit leaky so that the water would kind of seep through slowly, and over time it would freeze. And the beauty of this is that the glacier, the artificial glacier lower down the mountain would melt first, which was really important for irrigating spring crops. And then as that glacier was depleted, the glacier high up the mountain would start melting, and that would provide them with meltwater for into the harvest season. And so it's just like a really neat adaptation. It's another kind of example of what it looks like. And then, but they're not done yet. So one of Chewang Norfolk's successors, Sanan Wangchuck, he decided, well, you know what, these artificial glaciers are really cool, but they require a lot of work. It's really intensive to build such a thing, and it is also kind of expensive, even though they're using natural materials. It's a lot of labor. And so he was trying to find ways to create something else, something that might be a little bit cheaper, easier to create. And he came up with these ice stupas, and they're named after Buddhist temples because they kind of look like a Buddhist temple. And what it is that he has buried a pipe in the ground so that it doesn't freeze. He's collecting this meltwater from the glacier, and the pressure of this pipe as it flows down the mountain sprays the water up into the air, and as it comes down, it's settling into ice onto this structure made of willows and whatever other debris they have. As they continue to accumulate ice, they can add more willows and other branches so that more ice continues to form on this ice stupa. And it can be, these can be quite large, and it's kind of become a new, unique cultural thing where there's contests for who can build the biggest one, the most beautiful one. They come in all different shapes and sizes. One group had even, in India, had made a cafe out of one of them. So they're having a little fun with it. But really, it is a way to provide meltwater to villagers with just limited supplies. And while these are super cool, they're band-aids, really, to a long-term problem. It's a short-term solution to a long-term problem, because eventually we're not going to have ice left in order to use it. And so where will we get our water from? And I think we as a species are relatively short-term thinkers, and that's kind of because for most of our human history, we really haven't had to think much more than a few months or years at most ahead of time. So our focus on the present and near future, to ensure our survival, seasonal movements. So when you're only thinking about, just in a few years ahead of time, it's really difficult to see and think about and imagine that long-term thinking that we really need to solve our climate crisis. So with climate change, it really does for many of us, and I think that is starting to change, not fast enough. Feels like a problem for the future. And in reality, it's here. We know it's here. We see it with our own eyes. We hear about it on the news when there's wildfires, and then there's a snowstorm in the same area, a flood one year, and then wildfires the next. It's, those things are attributed to climate change. So it's hard to visualize our future, especially if you think you're not going to be in it, right? So we know what we need to do. Like, the science is in. It's been in for a really long time. And we need to draw down carbon. We need to live more sustainably on the earth. And I'm just going to read just a little bit from this book to finish up here. So ice patch archaeologists are responding to the climate crisis like emergency room doctors, triaging ice patches by focusing on those that yield, or are most likely to yield, the most cultural material, so that the loss of these heirlooms isn't total. It's an ambitious task, given that there are only a handful of ice patch archaeologists, hundreds of thousands of perennial ice patches worldwide, and a rapidly warming climate. Ice patch artifacts provide not only a portal to the past, but also a connection to the present that helps us think about our future, a future without ice. Within the ice is a cultural record of adaptation and response to past changes, but we're losing that record at a time when we need it most. It's a paradox. The more the ice melts, the more we learn about the past, while melting ice compromises our future. Although we can't rewind the clock to a time before human-caused climate change, we can use the knowledge gained from melting ice to help us respond more thoughtfully when considering the kind of future we want for ourselves and for the future generations of humans yet to be born. While it's tempting to think of ice patch archaeology as a silver lining to climate change, its very existence also signals its own demise. Because when the ice is gone, whatever organic objects were preserved within it will disappear forever. There will be no way to study ice because there will be no more ice to study. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of ice patch artifacts have already decayed from exposure after the ice around them melted. As one ice patch archaeologist once told me, it's a race with an uncertain finish line. And I'll just end with, this is the cover of my book, and although it looks fake, this is an actual photograph that's been colorized, and the colorization kind of makes it look like a cartoon. But in the Victorian era, people used to go, and before the Victorian era, people were kind of scared of glaciers, like in these valleys and these mountain communities. They thought they were all backwards and, leave them alone, these mountain people. And then they discovered, wow, these glaciers are pretty amazing, and they kind of set off a tourism craze that obviously continues to this day. So just a little bit of history about that photograph. And that's it. Take
And we have time for a few questions if anyone has a question.
Oh, yes, sorry. Down.
A lot of the ice patch artifacts that were recovered date to around 5,000 years old. Not all of them, but a significant number of them do, including the Iceman in Europe. Paleoclimates 5,000 years ago were much warmer than they are now, and a lot of those high elevation places, I think, were relatively ice-free. And the ice that buried all these things has come since then. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what was discovered in the Beartooth recently. There was a small forest of white bark pine trees that was buried under one of the ice patches. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I do, and it's going to take me a second to remember that paper. I read that paper, and it's by a group of scientists out of MSU and other scientists who found, a white bark pine forest that had been buried under ice
preserved and now exposed. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you any more than that because I don't recall exactly what it was.
Well, they're about 5,000 years old also.
Yeah.
Suggesting that it was warmer up there then
Right.
than now.
Right, yeah, so the tree line is, follows temperature. So as temperatures get warmer, the tree line goes higher up the mountain. And so during warmer periods, you're going to see trees that are higher in elevation. And so after those trees established themselves and grew and became mature, then it got colder, and that cold deposited so much ice in the mountains that they think that it killed those trees and killed them and preserved them, until now. And so we know that the ice, we can surmise that the ice has been there for 5,000 years because otherwise the trees would have decayed or just melted out and they wouldn't have found it. And then now, so the ice had been there for 5,000 years and now it's gone.
When you were talking about the innovations that cultures were making as far as harnessing the runoff, how old are most of those innovations? Are those things that are thousands of years old or really just sort of like in the last 200 years?
No, so the glacier growers, the original glacier growers, that's centuries old. Nobody really knows exactly how far back it goes. Many centuries, but that's it. They don't have any other information. As far as the more recent stuff, that's just in the last couple of decades. The new innovations for growing artificial glaciers and those ice stupas. And so there's an organization, a startup in Chile that is doing the same thing because the Himalayas and the Andes are very similar in terms of their dryness and their landscape. And so ice stupas are working really well there. I talked to one scientist who's from India. He had done a lot of work in the Ladakh region of India and the Himalayas on these ice stupas. He did a PhD in Switzerland and so created some ice stupas there as well and studied them and realized that even though Switzerland is a super mountainous country with lots of snow, the ice stupas don't work as well there. So it's not really a solution because it's wetter, because the solar radiation isn't what it is in the highest elevations of the Andes and the Himalayas.
And in the case of the glacier marriage, is that just because the ice begets more ice, it kind of attracts more water so it will grow? Or like the male, female, come on.
And I think that's part of their spirituality and their thinking about it as male and female ice, and so it probably has very little to do with the type of ice that they're pulling. And more to do with just that they're pulling ice and they're putting it together and they're kind of creating, what they do is they marry these glaciers and they leave it there for 3 years without checking on it. And they're not supposed to check on it, otherwise bad things will happen according to their beliefs. But in some areas they have, documented, and this is anthropological, word of mouth evidence that, these glaciers really do work and they really do grow. And it's exactly that. It's just this cold body that's covered in rocks, and because it is covered, there's this type of glacier called a rock glacier that is buried. If you get a light sediment or dust on a glacier, that actually accelerates its melt. But if it's big rocks and kind of, buried under a lot of debris, that actually helps to insulate it. And so when this ice is buried under these big rocks, sawdust, and other materials they put on it, I think that melt water as it comes in contact with the ice, then freezes, and then it kind of expands.
It's very cool.
Yeah. Yes.
So early on, when you talked about the caribou hunting and the bluffs that were built with stone and the objects that were recovered that were sticks, they looked like they were tied together. How were those actually used? Is there a parallel with bison drive lines? And if that's the case, were there sticks that were used also with bison drive lines?
I don't know about the bison drive lines and sticks, but in this case, they were used to, I'll just say archaeologists don't really know exactly how they were set up, right? So all of these, there aren't any that are set up that like standing as though they were in place, as though people were hunting them. A lot of what they find are these stashes of sticks. Like they had, rather than carry them up and down the mountain every season, they left them there in place. And so they're bundles of sticks. And sometimes you find ones here and there that are by themselves. But they haven't really figured out exactly how they set it up. Just that they have surmised that they probably used these sticks as a way to kind of herd the caribou towards these hunters behind the stone blinds.
And they look like they weren't very big.
No, they're not very big. They're like 3 feet, 4 feet tall. They're not very big.
Huh.
Yeah. And they were working with the materials that they had available, and they had to carry it all up because there weren't any trees up there.
Right.
So, yeah. Okay.
Want to take one final question here?
Sure.
I have just one other question about caribou. Historically, there's been caribou in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it was possible that prehistorically, like at the end of the Pleistocene, there were caribou on the Beartooth Plateau and some of those sites that they were being used to hunt caribou there?
From the historic maps I've looked at, it didn't seem like there were caribou this far south. And so I don't think so. And I don't think that there were caribou here. I think that they were mostly hunting bison, and they haven't found any of those bones at these ice patches. It's a lot of bighorn sheep and some bison.
Lisa, thank you so much. Thank you again for